Hello and welcome. Today I would like to talk to you about saber fencing. Yes, saber fencing has been gaining momentum recently here in Germany, and from what I've seen internationally elsewhere too, it's becoming more popular as a competitive sport. It seems less so when it comes to learning it in a structured way, but it's definitely very popular as a competitive sport. And there's one topic that's always been very important to me, and it's one of the basics of basic training. That's learning how to strike or executing blows properly.
Oder die Hiebe ordentlich auszuführen lernen.
When striking or slashing, it's very important to know and be familiar with a lot of contextualizing things, i.e. to know the context of the respective striking style and to learn how to strike accordingly. That means we have different eras of saber fencing culture, we have different schools of saber fencing culture, and we also have different contexts. For example, whether we execute saber blows on the battlefield or whether we execute saber blows in duels. And thirdly, whether we execute saber blows in sporting competitions. And all three of these areas already existed in the 19th century. In this video, I'd like to tell you a little about the different cutting and slashing techniques in saber fencing, or in slashing, as it was often called in the 19th century, about these different techniques that exist, and then also connect it with the question, which of these techniques do we actually need to learn today? And if we want to learn all of them, which ones are actually useful for sporting purposes today? A good source for this is Karl Timlich, who published his fencing books between the 1780s and 1817. He wrote several sources back then. He was imperial and royal fencing master for the imperial and royal life guards, and he wrote works for the cavalry, because the cavalry is the only unit that is actually equipped with cutting and stabbing weapons, from enlisted men up to officers, i.e. with broadswords or sabers, whereas small swords and sabers are mainly only used later by infantry officers or officers in general. This means that the enlisted men really only have their rifles with bayonets and no longer have sabers or swords in their equipment. This means that from the 19th century onwards, the saber once again became the typical weapon of the time. This means that we always have a cutting and thrusting weapon, and Karl Timlich wrote several works at this point, also for cavalrymen, both on horseback and on foot. In addition, he also writes works on thrust fencing and on thrust and cut fencing. That is, he leaves us with a broad portfolio of how to strike and stab, what fencing culture looks like in a military context and in a dueling context. Other sources, which I will cite later, also reveal the sporting context, or rather, the context one encounters in training with one's partner. Yes, let's start with Karl Timlich's variations. I'll demonstrate them a bit here on my striking bob from time to time. I'll add different camera angles later so that you can see what he actually means. Karl Timlich basically distinguishes between three different types of cuts for cut fencing on foot. With regard to these three types of cuts, it is important to know that Karl Timlich also belongs to a certain fencing culture that is still very strongly associated with the Italian thrusting school around Salvatore Fabris, and later also with Kreuzler in the German-speaking area. Accordingly, his posture and the way he strikes are different than in perhaps other schools. In this video, however, I don't want to go into too much detail about the different backswing and approach variations that exist, but really only about the way in which hits are landed, i.e. how the energy is supposed to be transferred to the opponent if a hit is made. The first cuts that Karl Timlich passed on and taught are the so-called pulling cuts, Zughiebe. Before we delve too deeply into the various schools of body posture and selection variations, the following is fundamental to the transfer of power when it comes to drawing blows. Carl Timlich speaks of the so-called point of impact. If we imagine our cutting diagram, regardless of whether we follow the German school or the fencing books of the 19th century, we always have an intersection point in the middle, which lies in line or, as it was previously called, in the long point. So there is a moment, wherever that is in reality on the body, where the weak point meets the opponent's body. A very important point here, and something that is mentioned again and again in the fencing books, is that a cut is not a hack. So you don't try to hack into your opponent or hack through them, as you might always see in cut tests. That is not the idea behind it. With a drawing blow, the idea is to hit with the last few centimeters of the weapon, and at the moment these centimeters hit, to exert more power through the target through tension and a slight pressure or pull. I'm going to do this extra slowly so that you can see it. Here too, the aim isn't to end up with too big a blow in the end, which would open up a big hole, but really just to hit the target and then pull through easily. If you do it faster, it will look like this. Or in a different line of blow. These are the so-called pulling blows. You pull or push through the target with the last few centimeters. If you do it slowly, it looks like a cut. With these blows, it's important that the blow itself is relaxed and that you only release tension in your arm and hand at the moment of impact, and then, preferably by pressing your hand and arm, pull through the weakness easily.
Von Hand und Arm die Schwäche leicht durchzieht.
With these blows, it's important. Timlich makes the context of these blows very clear. The blows are there to land a powerful hit. However, you don't use such blows against multiple opponents, nor do you use them if you want to perform several actions in succession. And they are mainly used as finishing blows, because the danger of the blows lies in movement, especially since in the cavalry we actually have a weapon of war, not a fencing weapon like here. I can't demonstrate that with a weapon of war, because then I would break my bob. The danger of what is known as a mishit is very high. That means that if you carry out really martial actions, which is what the blow is actually mainly intended for, with a heavy weapon weighing 1.2 kilos or so, then the danger is very high when you swing in, when you hit through with pressure, that you hit through. And when you hit through, which takes place with a lot of tension, you then stop very hard down here and are very exposed. That means that these blows are really only used as actions that are really meant to end the fight safely at the end. For example, if I have already dealt my opponent a few handicaps and can then really land a sure hit or can quickly retreat while pulling off. They can certainly be used in a duel, but according to Timlich, that's not what they are intended for. So firstly, remember the so-called Zukiebe, pulling blows or cuts, which are also very tiring, as Timlich also mentions. Here I have an Austrian Imperial and Royal Cavalry Sabre, an original from my collection. It weighs about 1.12 kilograms and is from the 1870s to 1890s. It's the 1869 model, if I remember correctly. And I just want to show, without actually intending to hit Bob, what a pulling blow like that would look like if you delivered a weapon like that, and how quickly you could mess up. That means I'm going to take up a position where I don't hit Bob, so as not to break him. If you did it with a smaller arm movement like in a duel, it would look exactly like this. If you do this on the battlefield with more of a swing, which will be mentioned later, you can see how much power there is and how quickly you can make a mistake.
und wie schnell man sich verhaut.
There really is a big difference between a dueling saber and, like here, a cavalry war saber. Another variation that Karl Timlich explicitly mentions for the battlefield with heavy cavalry weapons are the swing and sling blows. With these blows, it is particularly important that the weapon is held very loosely. If we just worked with tension in the drawing blow, it is now important that the weapon essentially passes through the center. You may know this from so-called Polish saber fencing, which is a more modern invention. There are Polish saber sources, but we can make a video about that another time. What is called cross-cutting there, or what Joachim Meyer or the German school already mentioned with Kreuzhiebe, Kreuzheue, which have been mentioned again and again throughout the history of fencing, is not something typically Polish. Yes, it is very important that the weapon is held loosely so that the weapon can swing through the center. But unlike what you often see in these Polish videos, it is not about making any cutting movements with the hand, but rather all cuts are struck through the long point, as we already know from the German school. That means it is not about somehow moving forward with the hand, where you have to get so close that you could actually hit your opponent straight away and cut through like that. Rather, it is simply about when I swing and swing, letting the weapon run out loosely and then cutting through again. It would look something like this. I'm here, alternating right and left chops through the small of my back, and the arm bend is adjusted accordingly as needed. You can also do it purely with the wrist, even with a heavy weapon. And that's the idea behind it on the battlefield, that these swing and sling cuts can be used easily, depending on the situation, to keep many enemies at bay. This is then combined with appropriate footwork, so that, for example, enemies who are in different areas can swing through. And that's how, as a cavalryman who is no longer mounted, you can defend yourself on foot against several enemies or advance as a line against other lines. So this is a purely military cut, and these cuts already have a problem when they meet resistance. And that's why it's so important that they remain loose compared to drawing cuts, so that you can still continue to strike from there even if you're blocked. So loose blows are extremely important as a summary of the first two in order to be able to make multiple moves. The pulling blow is only there as a finishing blow, and the swing and sling blows are actually there to fence against multiple opponents at the end or to stay moving on the battlefield. The size of these swing and sling blows is adapted to the situation, length of the fight, the time I need, the strength I need. There is a nice list of framework factors that the fencer then has to adapt his action accordingly in order to make the right decision in the fight. The last blows, and especially for the sporting area, the most exciting of all and for the duel, are the so-called striking blows. With these blows, it is again all about looseness. That means that during the entire blow, only the initial force is of interest, and then the weapon is simply let fly. And even when making contact, you hold the weapon loosely so that you can make several blows from this movement. Even if there is a misalignment or a parry and the blade then bounces off, I can still carry out the next move with ease, regardless of whether it is a parry or whether the opponent doesn't riposte, and I can then launch a follow-up attack. That only works with a relaxed arm and body posture. As soon as we have a lot of tension and power, it just doesn't work. That means lots of movements in a row require relaxation. And that's why the striking blow is the most exciting for a duel. In a duel, it's important to make few small movements, and if I do make lots of them, that they are very small and offer little exposure, because I have this one opponent who is completely focused on me. I'll now show you how a striking blow like that can still look with a heavy weapon, because mass is a big factor here, using the bob. To do this, I position it a bit more to the side and use Timlich's swing variation. Simply draw a circle or a wheel around the head with the so-called overlift, and then I simply let the momentum of the weapon act on Bob with initial force. You can see that because those 1.1 kilos have so much force and the center of gravity is very far forward, this weapon has enough energy to act even when loose. However, in 19th century saber duels or duels with slashing weapons, this isn't so important because the opponent isn't wearing armor. In the 19th century, your tunic was still called armor. Accordingly, even without armor, a blow has a good effect. The fight is usually over as soon as the first blood is drawn or someone is incapacitated. After every hit, the seconds immediately step in and stop the fight to watch. That means that if you simply land a slashing blow there, it would usually stop immediately and cause a sufficient wound to end the fight, even with just a shirt. That is basically the typical dueling blow. And in relation to our fencing sport, when we say we compete, we fence in training, these striking blows are also the ones that protect our partner or opponent the most. So these are the safest blows because with these striking blows we can land very gentle yet quick hits, but we can also continue working immediately during a parry without cutting through too badly. Here's another exciting story in comparison to proper fencing sabers and the desire, which I often notice both as a manufacturer and as a teacher and tournament participant at many events, to have the perfect all-rounder. So many people want a weapon that comes close to being a service and war weapon. Let's say the cavalry saber at 1.1 kg, because it looks nice and that's a thing, a nice wide blade, but still safe enough to use in tournaments, competitions and training sessions where I can land a hit on my opponent. The problem is, our ancestors didn't do it that way either. I wrote a separate article about this, which you are welcome to read. I will be posting something from time to time. Even the original sabers that I have, over 12 of them now from continental Europe, which are really meant to be used for hitting, are generally much lighter and more flexible than military and service weapons. This is also mentioned specifically in the texts so that you can protect your partner and learn the art. So in the end, wielding a heavier weapon is one thing, especially for solo training, getting to grips with the weapon, learning the intricacies of fencing and developing confidence is done with fencing weapons. My MK2 Saber, for example, is very similar to the original practice of fencing sabers. And the advantage here is that with these very flexible blades, which also bend horizontally, you can sometimes deliver very nice drawn blows without seriously injuring your opponent because the blade gives way during the blow. Unfortunately, this is not possible with most of the sabers currently on the market. It would cause a lot of pain. And I have some videos or scenes from my tournaments that I can upload here, where you can see that it's important to focus more on the correct stroke and above all on the correct energy transfer of a sporting stroke. Just take a quick look.
But that's okay, there's a systemic But that's okay, there's a systemic
Yes, you should have seen by now that a lot of fencers, when they're about to land a hit and their opponent is suddenly no longer there, they often strike with their sword pointing backwards. This means that we have a lot of very powerful strikes that really shouldn't be there. Because, as I said, this is a practice saber based on historical originals, which are very light and flexible. If I do it with a weapon that's a bit stiffer, let's take a cavalry saber for example, and if I just strike with a loose blow that hits without stopping, then it wouldn't turn out so well for the other person, not even in a tournament, because it wasn't even with power, it was just a loose strike. And unfortunately you see this very often at tournaments, that some fencers just strike with the wrist the whole time. And if they then hit their partner, they can inflict serious injuries. And in the end, as a manufacturer, you then have to somehow come up with additional equipment which wouldn't be necessary if we simply looked at the context and said, okay, we'll adapt to the historical context with compromises. So with a light weapon you can also perform the through blows, just as our ancestors did back then. And it simply makes a difference whether you're interested in practicing war fencing or dueling fencing. And I'm not here to say that you can't practice war fencing in historical fencing, you just have to think about how you can do it. Do you do solo training and drills by hitting the air, or do you just hit phantoms like this, bob or dolls? Or do you use foam sabers instead of steel weapons? With those, I can perhaps also depict war fencing more safely. Or do I just say, okay, I'm actually learning dual fencing now and I'd like to fight one-on-one all the time, then maybe something like this is the better choice. And so my idea was to make a video in which I show that our ancestors also had this idea of fencing safely, that they thought about how to adapt blows to transfer energy and impulses to the opponent in different ways, and applied this in a contextualized way and then practiced it excessively. I'll also point to a few other sources where you can see how the training context was adapted back in the early 19th century, where it is explicitly mentioned, okay, there are those who, like the berserkers, let's say, lash out and don't spare their partner. We don't really want that in fencing. We want you to win the fight with skill and finesse, and to protect your partner in training and in athletic duels in the so-called assault, even with protective equipment. And a nice note that can also be found is that blows should be executed in a springy manner. What ultimately follows is the striking blow that Karl Timlich recommends. Comes close to, and what we still know from Olympic saber fencing today, and which can also be found again and again in fencing sources from the 19th century, is the so-called cushioning cut. This is at the end of the striking cut, so to speak, where you no longer add any additional energy after the initial energy. So you swing your cut in whatever variation, depending on the school, and give it initial energy, and then you let it hit, holding your hand so loosely that the blade easily bounces off the target. It's not about pulling it back, don't get me wrong. It should stay in line after the hit so that you can continue working. Yes, it is a skill that is not easy to acquire. You really have to train for it, use the appropriate training methods. And at my school, it's part of the fencing training to be able to deliver these blows too, not just the sharp, serious blows, but above all the sporting blows, because we really enjoy fencing with other people and don't want to hurt them. And it doesn't matter what weapon you use. You can learn with a one-handed sword, a saber, a knife, a longsword, with any of them, and it's a lot more fun.
Und hat sehr viel mehr Spaß dabei.
I hope I've been able to give you a brief overview of some ideas. As you know, the art of fencing isn't something you learn through indoctrination. There are always many other variations, because fencing masters have always been very diverse, the schools very mixed and differentiated, and that's how it is today. But if you want to fence with someone under sporting conditions, you have to make compromises. And that's always been the case, and it always will be. And I would be happy if, when I go to tournaments, as a competitor, as a participant, or even with my students, I didn't get hit with swinging and slinging blows or drawn blows, but rather that my opponents really try to win with finesse, through perfection, timing, speed, tactics, and strategy, and not with powerful, continuous blows. Thank you very much and see you next time.